Good evening and welcome to the British School at Rome, both to everyone here in the lecture theatre and also to all of those listening online. Tonight is the second talk in the City of Rome course lecture series, a programme of public lectures accompanying the BSR's annual postgraduate course, where masters and early stage PhD students from UK universities spend 2 months here at the school studying the history, archaeology and topography of the ancient city. I'm Christopher Shevitsky, the course director, and it is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Dan Diffendale. Dan is an archaeologist specializing in Roman architecture and in particular, the economy and technology of stoneworking. Dan received his PhD from the University of Michigan in 2017 with a thesis focusing on the Republican temples at Santa Mabono. He subsequently remained in Michigan as a lecturer in the Department of Classical Studies and then a research associate at the Kelsey Museum of Archaeology before holding a research fellowship at the University of Missouri, Columbia. In 2019, Dan moved to Italy as the Rome Prize Fellow at the American Academy, examining questions of quarry provenance and the thorny issue of dating tuffs. Following a fellowship at the German Archaeological Institute in 2021, Dan took up a research post at the Scuola Superiore Meridionale in Naples. And as of January of this year, he has been at the Scuola Normale Superiore di Pisa, where he is investigating the stone and pozzolana quarries in and around Rome in the imperial era as part of the major ERC project, the Inscribed City, Urban Structures and Interaction in Imperial Rome. While Dan's use of geochemistry and petrography in his research presumably means he spends much time in the lab, evidently he spends just as much time outdoors in the field and has excavated at sites across Greece and Italy, including Santa Mabono in Rome, the Temple of Venus in Pompeii, at Metaponto, at Cumae, and at Rossano di Vaglio in Basilicata, where he is co-field director. Dan has published extensively both on these excavations and also his wider research area of Roman building materials, and in particular tuff. His work is increasing our appreciation of the Romans' judicious selection of stone and contributing to a much fuller picture and more nuanced understanding of the stone's provenances. Tonight's lecture comes at the perfect moment in our course program. Not only have the students already been exposed to the countless examples of ever-present tuff, cementing an appreciation for its centrality to Roman architecture, but yesterday they were exploring one of the quarries with hard hats and torches, albeit probably not an ancient quarry, underneath the Caelian Hill. Tonight's title, The Roman Tuffs Revisited, Local Stone for the Eternal City. Will you please welcome Dr. Dan Diffendale.
Well, thank you very much, Chris, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here, and also to the public following remotely and the shadowy public in the future from the recorded talk. Right. You will all be familiar, I imagine, with the phrase attributed by the Roman historian Suetonius to the Emperor Augustus, that he had found the city one of brick and left it one of marble. It's not my intention to enter into the debate about the nature of these bricks. Rather, I'd like to call your attention to the materials that Augustus's quip omits, yet which comprise a considerable percentage of the contemporary public architecture of the city. This is the variety of local rocks that during the reign of Augustus was widely exploited for ashlar blocks, as well as for aggregate and facing of concrete construction, namely the various volcanic tuffs that are found in and around the city of Rome. In the Augustan imaginary, these building materials had a different valence than the poverty of brick or the luxury of marble. Indeed, later in the same book, Suetonius reports on the humble nature of the life of Octavian, who for a time lived on the Palatine in the house of Hortensius, which, quote, was remarkable neither for size nor elegance, having but short colonnades with columns of Alban stone, and rooms without any marble decorations or handsome pavements. This Alban stone, or lapis albanus, is a variety of volcanic tuff that was quarried from the Alban Hills southeast of Rome, in the territory of what is now the town of Marino. Although during the 5th century BCE, this had probably been one of the most expensive building stones to bring to Rome, by the end of the 1st century BCE, such costs had been dwarfed by the import of marbles from distant shores, their costs borne by the fruits of empire, with the result that columns of lapis albanus tuff could first become signifiers of humility and then fall out of the macro view entirely, totally eclipsed by marble veneers. So my basic subject this evening is building materials, and more precisely, the various volcanic rocks called tuffs that support and surround the city itself. While this might sound relatively straightforward, over the next 55 minutes or so, I am to show you just how straightforward it isn't. Let me take one of those minutes to give the briefest of geological introductions before returning to deal with this more fully later in the talk. When volcanoes erupt explosively, they sometimes generate pyroclastic flows, supercharged emulsions of shattered magma, volcanic gases, and air from the atmosphere that sweep across the landscape. When a pyroclastic flow comes to rest, it can sometimes become consolidated into rock by a series of chemical mechanical processes, and the rock that results is often called tuff. Rome is bracketed by 2 volcanoes, north and south, multiple eruptions of which deposited multiple kinds of tuff, among other materials, onto which and out of which the city was built. Now, that lack of straightforwardness. What exactly tuff is depends on who you're asking, where and when. Even the use of the word tuff itself varies. Some of you may be waiting for me to address the tuff, tufa, tufo debate, but if you're curious, you can ask me during the question and answer period. Part of my broader research involves trying to unpack these ways of understanding, the different typologies that have been used over time by different disciplines and observers in an attempt to rationalize these. It's as much a historiography as it is an ongoing attempt to understand tuff through its entire life cycle as a foundational material used to build Rome. Before going any further, though, I would like to pose the question, why study building materials? Why should we spend our precious time and resources as scholars and archaeologists trying to decide what particular kind of rock was used for a particular wall at a particular place at a particular moment in time? Though it might seem a niche interest, such studies can contribute to multiple subdisciplines within the broad field of ancient studies, including but not limited to economic history, architectural history, environmental history, labor history. Or to reframe it, starting from the ground up, when we as archaeologists are confronted with the remains of ancient structures, whether still largely standing or a series of small walls, we want to understand these remains. We may also confront questions of their conservation. So it behooves us to understand the entire cycle of construction, labor, material sourcing, extraction, transport, design, material constraints, and choice along the way. It takes us into dimensions of materials provenance studies, enhanced by increasingly sophisticated scientific analyses, creating the possibility of promising connections that enrich our understanding of the cycle. Under the right conditions, the use of a particular kind of material can tell us something about the date of the structure that it was used in. And the best known case here are the so-called Servian walls of Rome, traces of which still emerge here and there around the city, most famously in and around Termini Station. These maintain their traditional name because for a long time they were ascribed to King Servius Tullius. His reign is traditionally placed in the mid-6th century BCE. The Roman historian Livy ascribes a fortification of the city to him. These walls, however, were constructed using a huge quantity of yellow tuff of a type that is not found within the immediate vicinity of the city. It was extracted, in fact, from quarries in the territory of the Etruscan city of Veii, upstream along the Tiber north of Rome. Given ongoing hostility, or at least rivalry, between the two cities, this line of argument goes, it is inconceivable that the Veientines would have permitted their neighbors to extract such a massive amount of stone to fortify Rome. Hence, the walls as we see them must date to after the Roman conquest of Veii at the beginning of the 4th century BCE. This hypothesis was proposed by Tenny Frank in 1918, about whom I'll have much more to say shortly, and very quickly widely accepted. The walls were thus ascribed to a different fortification project reported by Livy during the 4th century, thanks to the correct identification of the building stone employed and its quarries of origin. So there are many reasons to study building materials in archaeology. Its material provenance studies contribute to larger studies of energetics in the extended work site or cantiere, to better understand the labor and the resources that ancient societies could muster and the complexity of their logistical organization, how the affordances of the different materials available contributed to shape the development of architectural forms, the relationship between the urban center and its immediate and more distant hinterland, contribution of building materials to dating architecture, and the study of places and technologies of extraction themselves. Any research that involves the study of building materials needs to be able to identify the particular type at hand and name it. And there's no denying that there can be a certain satisfaction in feeling we have correctly identified the stone in front of us, an antiquarian impulse, if you will. And to be clear, I mean no slight by the adjective antiquarian. There's a risk, however, that we remain satisfied with a simple identification, as if by naming the problem, we have solved it. And we'll see how that can be misleading. Identification requires, in the first place, being able to decide what distinguishes one material from another, whether stone or any other category of thing in the world. In short, creating a typology. And this is easier said than done. There are multiple possible ways of classifying rocks exploited as building materials. Very simply, for instance, you could divide based on visual characteristics and assign a descriptive name, such as red stone, yellow tuff, or with more detail, red tuff with black scoriae, for instance. Alternatively, you could divide your stone according to where it was extracted. So if quarried in the Alban Hills, it could be the Alban stone, lapis albanus, that we've already met. If at Tibur, modern Tivoli, the Tiburtine stone, lapis tiburtinus, and so on. An architect or contractor using stone in a building project would probably need to know a more specific provenience from a specific quarry belonging to a specific person or family, and at an even finer grain from what part of that quarry, what quarry face, where in that face. Now, we essentially lack all such information for the stone extracted around Rome in terms of specific quarries, although we have epigraphic evidence for similar systems in use for Roman decorative stone quarried elsewhere in the empire. Even within the span of a single quarry face, a stonecutter might recognize variations in the mass of rock, the identification of which is useful to his work. This could be as simple as distinguishing between rock that is too hard to cut with the normal tools available and that which is sufficiently workable. In a similar vein, that same architect or contractor would want to distinguish between rocks that have mechanical properties, resistance to compression or to weathering, for instance, that meet the needs of the structure that is to be built. Geologists define rocks in a variety of ways. Some geological types take into account the observable characteristics of the rock, again, like the red tuff with black scoriae. We also meet with what are called genetic descriptions, which distinguish on the basis of the origin or genesis of the rock. In the case of tuffs, which particular volcanic eruption from which volcano. And the resulting rocks are often given a name that depends on a type site, a place in the landscape where that formation was first identified or where a representative section of it is exposed. And a key example here is a tuff called by geologists tuffo del Palatino, tuff of the Palatine, which, although it was deposited over a vast area east and south of Rome, is named by reference to a representative outcrop on the Palatine Hill. So tuffo del Palatino doesn't mean that that tuff necessarily came from the Palatine. So we've already seen here multiple ways to identify the same rock with different degrees of specificity and according to different attributes. And one of my basic points is that typologies are tools, not immutable descriptions of unchanging reality, and that like any tool, they should be chosen with due consideration for the task at hand. And what's more, they require sharpening over time. I'd also like to iterate a basic principle of contemporary classical archaeology, which is that different categories of evidence require different methods of analysis. A passage from an ancient Latin author is not the same kind of evidence as a wall or a potsherd or a tomb assemblage. A synthetic archaeological study may well draw on multiple categories of evidence, but it should do so ideally deliberately and only after each category has been understood on its own merits. And the classificatory systems currently dominant as regards the Roman tuffs are frankly a mess in this regard, combining in the same breath Vitruvius with building history and fragments of 20th and 21st century geology. Because the question of the identification and naming of the various tuffs is so fundamental for any attempt at studying urban building materials, and because its typologies typically engender confusion, I'm going to attempt to walk you through some of the various approaches to typologizing tuff, which will take us from the Roman Republic to the late 19th century and down to the present day. And I apologize in advance to those colleagues who studied the medieval and post-medieval periods, as I will say very little about these this evening. They're not for lack of interest, only lack of time. And I'll wait a minute if anyone cares to leave. Now, I'd like to now focus on an often neglected typological tool, which is the embodied knowledge of stonecutters. Its neglect by archaeologists is entirely understandable. Our sources for the kinds of knowledge embodied in those who work with stone, whether in antiquity or more recently, are truly exiguous. But it's worth our time to try. And I'll begin with what we could consider an ethnographic example, which comes from Naples in the early 20th century, where a tradition of extracting the local tuff, broadly similar to some of the Roman tuffs that we have seen and will see, was well established. And I'm relying mostly on a book called Il Tuffo Giallo Napoletano, the Neapolitan Yellow Tuff, published by Luigi Dell'Erba in 1923. Dell'Erba was a professor of applied geology who developed an extensive overview of the Neapolitan stone building material par excellence, yellow tuff, from constant visits to active quarries in addition to his academic research. Beyond his descriptions of geology, quarry types, and manners of extraction, he is at pains to report the actual terminology and Neapolitan dialect used by the workers. According to 21st century geology, all tuffo giallo napoletano is the product of a single volcanic eruptive event, a single geological rock type. The volcanologist can and do distinguish between several different parts or facies of this rock. And the little excerpt of a geological map in the center there, the yellow, some outcrops of Neapolitan yellow tuff. But Dell'Erba, on the basis of his conversations with the stoneworkers, describes in some detail, based on structure, grain, frequency, and dimension of inclusions, hardness, tenacity, color, and further by workability, resistance, position in the deposit, and defects, 36 types distinguishable within the yellow tuff deposit, for 17 of which he reports names used by the quarrymen themselves, including indicating their status as practical functional types. In addition, he reports 4 generic names used by the stonecutters that describe types of tuff unsuitable for use in construction. So we have here a practical typology meaningful in the work of the stonecutters that divides into 20-some different varieties, a rock that appears on a geological map as a single unit, divided at most into 3 or 4 lithofacies or subtypes. This is not to say that the practical typology is better or that the geological classification is wrong. Each typology is merely a tool and clearly applied at different scales. The numerous categories of Neapolitan yellow tuff collected by Dell'Erba reflect a long and well-articulated tradition of stoneworking at Naples, stoneworking that in his time was still carried out almost entirely by hand. The Neapolitan stoneworkers of the day had a saying, "La preta cambia da palmo a palmo." The stone changes from palm to palm. While perhaps incidental, the palm as a distance of measurement itself reminds us how much this is or was an embodied knowledge that ill translates to the written word. You may not be surprised to learn that we do not have any similar document for Rome, certainly not for antiquity, nor for the modern period, at least to the best of my knowledge. The Roman tuffs were still used extensively for construction during the late 19th and early 20th century, but one of the principal means of extraction was the use of explosives to create rubble for aggregate, the work of which does not require such intimate knowledge of the stone. This well-articulated system notwithstanding, it is clear from Dellerba and others that the most important distinction for the Neapolitan quarrymen was between soft and hard rock, which is to say between rock that was easy to cut and rock that was too hard to cut, at least in a cost-effective manner with the tools at hand. Such a distinction between soft and hard rock is a highly relative one, but it is one that recurs again and again in pre-mechanized stoneworking traditions, both in Italy and around the Mediterranean. As per Peter Rockwell, relying on his own long experience as a sculptor, hardness is just one of the working properties of stone, though a very important one, which affects, among other things, the tools used. And Rockwell stresses that this is not necessarily an analytically verifiable category, but arises from the worker's response to the stone. We have only rare echoes of this practical hard-soft distinction made by ancient stonecutters, which nevertheless support its antiquity, unsurprisingly. A letter in Greek preserved on papyrus from the Fayum in Egypt, dated to 256 BCE, attests to the real consequences of the hard rock, soft rock distinction to stonecutters. Among them, injustice and increased wearing out of their tools. Now, predictably, again, we lack any similar document from the area of Rome itself. What we do have is Vitruvius, his hour come round at last. In Book 2 of the De Architectura, Vitruvius, writing in the second half of the 1st century BCE, offers an account of building stones around Rome. He provides a schematic typology of stone according to hardness, distinguishing between soft stones, moles, stones of moderate hardness, temperatae, and hard stones, durae. This classification certainly derives from practical experience, though it is hard to judge just how much of it was accumulated over centuries as opposed to Vitruvius's own observations. Seth Bernard has posited a mid-Republican origin for this type of classification, given the presence within it of certain quarries, such as fidenates, but I would suggest caution on the identification of these. Within Vitruvius's soft stone category are 4 types, including red stone, fading stone, or possibly stone from Palla, we don't know for sure, stone from Fidenae, an old city just north of Rome, and Alban stone. And these probably correspond with some of the various types of what today we consider volcanic tuff. I would suggest, however, that we resist the temptation to immediately play the old antiquarian game of matching up ancient names with actually observable things in the world. I had said just now that Vitruvius offers a typology of stone. In fact, though, he writes not of lapides immediately, but lapidecinae, quarries, specific stone from specific quarries or quarry zones. When he turns to describe lithic resources elsewhere in Italy, he writes simply of lapides, stones, which are much less specifically localized. And this helpfully reminds us of one possible typological system for tuff and other building stones, identifying it by its source quarry. It's clear, in any case, from reading Vitruvius and other ancient authors, that, for instance, the Alban quarries, Lapidecinae albanae, produced the material called lapis albanus. From the Lapidecinae rubrae, the red quarries, came lapis ruber, and so on. Vitruvius acknowledges that these classifications had practical ramifications. The soft stones, he says, are easy to cut and work, but not very resistant to atmospheric exposure. Stones of moderate hardness, such as travertine, he continues, are weather resistant and better at bearing stress, but more vulnerable to fire. This, he explains, is due to their composition, his particular understanding of which was also theoretically based on the ancient conception of natural elements. And this opens up a whole other possible way of thinking about typologies of stone, which we don't have time to get into tonight. As a final practical aspect, Vitruvius tells us that he would have preferred to use somewhat harder and more resistant stone for building projects at Rome. But, quote, necessity compels the use of the nearby quarries that supply the soft lapis rubere and lapis pollens, revealing an unsurprising attention to the practical considerations of sourcing and logistics. We have other scattered attestations of the same names for types of stone around Rome from later authors, such as Pliny and Tacitus, but nothing as systematic as this passage of Vitruvius, and then bits and pieces of nomenclature for the following 2 millennia. In the interest of time, I'm going to jump forward to the early 20th century, but if you have questions, we can come back later. Now, if you have studied any Roman architecture or opened a guidebook to the city's archaeology, such as those by Amanda Claridge or Filippo Corelli, you will probably have encountered a list enumerating a certain number of such tuffs, each distinguished by name, color, and other physical characteristics, and perhaps something about its period of use. And everything should seem fairly straightforward. You see them here on the slide. Some are already familiar. Capellaccio, Grotto Oscura, Fidenae, Monteverde, Anio, Peperino or Lapis albanus, Lapis gabinus, and Travertine. And you'll recognize some of these from Vitruvius as well. This type of list is not new. In fact, the lists found in Claridge, Corelli, and elsewhere trace their origin to a book published a century ago by Tenny Frank, titled Roman Buildings of the Republic, an attempt to date them from their materials. Frank, an American ancient historian, is today better known either for his economic survey of ancient Rome, or indeed infamous for a publication that has to do with a different type of classification, his 1916 article titled Race Mixture in the Roman Empire, in which, harnessing a detailed epigraphic study to fundamentally racist assumptions, he blames multiculturalism and immigration for the fall of Rome. Be that as it may, in Roman buildings, Frank brought together contemporary geological knowledge. He cites in particular publications by Antonio Verri, the leading Roman geologist of the day, with a census of surviving buildings at Rome attributed to the Republican period, and a kind of survey of stone quarries around the city and its outskirts. The objective of Frank's study, and hence his typological tool, is made explicit by the book's subtitle, an attempt to date Roman buildings from their materials. By creating a list of different types of stone and establishing their relative periods of use, he hoped to be able to assign a chronology to buildings not otherwise datable. This approach had worked well to resolve the debate already mentioned over the chronology of the so-called surveying walls, which had to be 4th century because they used stone from the territory of Veii, and Frank endeavored to apply the same method to all of the stone types used in Republican architecture. In order to achieve this, however, he had to identify those different types of stone. He spelled out his method to subdivide the existing classifications of tuff, or what he called tufa, to a greater level of detail and identify quarries of each resulting type, combining all this with dated monuments to propose a chronology for the use of each type of stone. Of note here is his insistence on, quote, finding the very quarry from which each kind came. Numerous large-scale ancient quarries were visible in the landscape around Rome in the early part of the 20th century. By whim of chance and development, many of these can still be found today, though frequently reduced or damaged, while others have disappeared entirely. Thus, his method consisted of identifying still existing quarries and attempting to match the material he observed in the quarries with the materials observed in monuments. Only in one case, that of red tuff with black scoriae, which he called Fidenae tufa, was he unable to find quarries corresponding to the material observed in ancient construction. Frank took his names from a variety of sources. Capellaccio was, quote, the popular name of the stone. Grotto Oscura is the name of the locality in north of Rome where large quarries of this material are located. Lapis albanus and lapis gabinus, or Gabine stone, are borrowed from Vitruvius and other ancient authors, though other modern scholars had already made the connection. In particular, he distinguished 2 quarries or quarry areas within a single volcanic deposit, which Roman geologists, that is modern Roman geologists, had been calling tuffolithoide, lithoid tuff, for a century by that point. Frank thought he could distinguish between the tawny brown lithoid tuff that was extracted in quarries along the Anio River which came from quarries in the area of Monteverde, south of Trastevere. An important distinction because he recognized a chronological distinction in their use, which after all was the point of the study, asserting that Monteverde tuff was used somewhat earlier than Anio tuff, but disappeared from use after the end of the Republican period. So Frank created his typology to be a tool for dating Roman monuments, but in so doing, he drew equivalences between materials and quarries visible in the present and names known from the ancient sources, again, a sort of antiquarian approach, although relatively geologically informed. Frank was explicit that, quote, his monograph was put forth as a preliminary investigation, noting, again, quote, a larger work on the building materials of Rome has been projected by the Carnegie Institution of Washington, and that is to provide scientific analyses of all materials used and also a history of building construction, end quote. This larger work was to be carried out by Esther van Diemen, the doyenne of Roman building material studies, though she did not live to see it completed. Frank's book was generally well received, reviewed, and as we have seen, his typological scheme has been much followed. Privately, however, not everyone agreed. In a letter several years later, Esther van Diemen herself expressed her displeasure about Frank's names. In fact, I'm bothered by your names, she wrote to a curator at the University of Michigan who had inquired about acquiring reference samples. For they are the doubtful choice of Tenny Frank and are largely useless. Grota Scura Tuffa is senseless, for this is only one quarry which he liked out of many other sections. Fidenae Tuffa means only a theory of his own and cannot be made a genuine term, at least until he's proved his theory. Monteverde may pass, but it's doubtful. Better use Lanciani's divisions or those of a geologist. Anio tuff is fluid, for Grota Scura Tuffa is found in abundance in the same section. I think I shall stick to color in my work, with maybe Monteverde, since it's still in use. I am sorry Frank made your job harder by doing unscientific work in that book. Before her death, Van Diemen entrusted her notes and the project as a whole to Marion Blake. Despite the interruption of the Second World War, Blake ultimately managed to publish 3 impressive, though too often overlooked, volumes on Roman construction with the Carnegie Institution, the fruit of a period in which the excessively rich still felt called to fund semi-ergotism, though ultimately no scientific analyses on materials were carried out. Despite Van Diemen's reservations, Blake more or less accepted the types enumerated by Frank, though she more than once expressed doubts about some of his chronological conclusions, as well as questioning his division between Anio and Monteverde tuffs. In order to better understand the dynamics of this division, we need now to dive more deeply into the geological arcana. Brace yourselves. You need to drink water or something. For reasons of time, I cannot consider tonight the treatment of tuffs in Giuseppe Lulli's very important La Tecnica Edilizia Romana, Roman building techniques. Suffice it to say that he too follows Frank in distinguishing Anio and Monteverde with a chronological distinction. So we turn now to the typologies of contemporary geology, which one might innocently consider to be the most objective. Even here, however, there's no single and unified system, and the systems that exist are not stable. Volcanology, like the things it studies, is a very active science, and understandings of the processes of volcanic eruptions that lead to the emplacement of volcanic rock are constantly undergoing revision. Don't worry about the details on this slide. This is just give you a sense of there are various schools of thought. Summarizing, we can say that there are terms that describe the formation processes of rock, the kinds of events and processes that led to their existence, the so-called genetic classifications. And since the 1960s, 4 schools of genetic classification for volcaniclastic rocks have been developed. And then there are terms that describe the physical, chemical characteristics of the rock itself. And there are 2 major systems of these in use today, based on the textural characteristics and the grain size of the rock. Here again, we find that there's no single objective geologically defined reality that we as archaeologists could access if only we could wade through the terminology. The world is infinitely complex, and our division of it into types can only ever be imperfect. Once again, typologies are tools, and the careful craftsperson should always endeavor to choose the right tool for the job at hand. Let's try to walk through a simplified geological understanding of the formation of the Roman tuffs, focusing on one in particular, the tuffo leonato, that tuff that was divided by Frank into Anio and Monteverde, to see how these different approaches can bring us to cross purposes. Tuff is primarily composed of the shattered products of magma erupted by volcanoes. At a high level, then, we can begin with the so-called Roman magmatic province, which is a series of 4 volcanoes characterized by similar major and trace element and or isotopic compositions in their source magma, so the material that waits below the surface for its moment to erupt. Of these, the 2 southernmost are relevant for us: the Monte Sabatini to the north of the city of Rome, and the Colli Albani, or Alban Hills, to the south, also known as the Vulcano Laziale. Multiple eruptions of these 2 volcanoes deposited great quantities of material, beginning 600,000 or so years ago, with the last major eruptions occurring around 36,000 years ago, although recent studies suggest that neither of these volcanoes is fully extinct. So just be aware in the next 10,000 years or so that either of these could erupt again. And yeah, here we see those 2 in detail. At a macro level, geologists divide the rocks that result from volcanic eruptions into eruptive units. These are the basic units of volcanic stratigraphy, which we can compare to the stratigraphic units fundamental in contemporary archaeology. An eruptive unit is a group of volcanic deposits produced by an eruption that are considered a single volcanic event. So just as an archaeological stratigraphic unit should be the result of a single event in the past, so a volcanic eruptive unit is the product of a single volcanic event. An eruptive unit generally corresponds to a single color on a geological map. And defining the boundaries is not always easy. If you have experience of archaeological excavation, you'll notice that sometimes it's difficult to decide exactly where one SU finishes and another begins. Now imagine that on a scale of tens or hundreds of square kilometers, in which the unit is exposed only occasionally, has been built over, cut through, eroded away, and so on. Complicating things further is that eruptive units are rarely uniform or homogeneous throughout. They may be divided into what are called facies or lithofacies, which have different characteristics that depend on differences in eruption conditions, on the local topography, or the dynamics of emplacement, as well as on post-depositional processes that affect the stratigraphic unit. So let's take a quick look at an excerpt from a geologic map. In this case, sheet 387 of the geological map of Italy at a scale of 1 to 50,000, which covers the zone around Albano Laziale, south of Rome. And at the right here, you see part of the crater of the Alban Lake, which is a vent of the Alban Hills volcano. And you can see that there's a very extensive pale purple band in the center of the map. If we look at the map key, which is ordered stratigraphically, we can see that color represents an eruptive unit called the Formazione di Villaseni. This Villaseni formation was deposited by the Villaseni eruption of the Alban Hills volcano, an eruption which has been dated to about 350,000 years ago. And if you see here, the Villaseni formation is divided into different zones called facies that are identified on the basis of their characteristics and which correspond to different phases of the same volcanic eruption. The Villaseni eruption included 2 different pyroclastic flows, the products of which are found stacked one right above the other. Once a pyroclastic flow comes to rest, its components can become consolidated into stone by the minerals formed from crystallization from the gas or the breakdown of hot glass fragments. And this process acted on the first pyroclastic deposit of the Villaseni eruption to produce a lithoid tuff, which is to say a tuff that has the nature of stone, which often makes it suitable as construction material. The second Villaseni pyroclastic flow produced what are called pozzolanelle, represented in the key here is VSN subscript 2. In this case, the volcanic ash did not undergo lithification, and it remained a not very consolidated volcanic dust, which was sometimes exploited by Romans, ancient and modern, as pozzolana for mortar and concrete. Geologists have distinguished further facies within the pozzolanelle, which present different physical characteristics while remaining attributable to the same pyroclastic flow, these sub-symbols here in the key. How are we doing? You need a moment for your heads to stop spinning, or we keep on going? So let's spend a little bit more time looking in detail at the type of tuff produced by the first Villiceni pyroclastic flow, the tuffo leonato. Already 2 centuries ago, in 1820, the naturalist Brocchi had called this tuffo lithoide, lithoid tuff, and this remained its usual geological definition throughout the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th, sometimes supplemented or varied with the color descriptive term leonato, tawny or lion-colored. Brocchi identified many different outcrops of this lithoid tuff, often exposed in quarries, ancient and modern, in different neighborhoods of Rome, including Monteverde and along the Anio. He did not, however, divide it into facies. It was Tenny Frank who, as we've seen, first proposed a distinction, typological distinction between Anio and Monteverde varieties of tuffo leonato. And his purpose, we remember, was to use building materials as a means of establishing chronology. This distinction was important in this regard. There are multiple ancient quarries preserved along the Anio River that produced a tawny brown tuff. Frank, quote, found it impracticable to attempt a differentiation, designating all alike for the present as Anio tufa. And then there's a variety of brown stone that needs to be distinguished from the Anio tufa because its quarry had a peculiar history and its occurrences, therefore, of a particular service to chronology. This is the Monteverde stone, end quote. So we can see how his invention of the Monteverde type was motivated by his desire to use building materials for chronological purposes. By contrast, Marion Blake wrote, referring to these Frank's subcategories, all these stones are what the more recent publications wisely call lithoidal tufas, the tuffo lithoide of long history, since it is often difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish one from another. And she continues, Frank has distinguished 4 strata, but he believed that the ancients never cut through to find the good material in the 4th stratum, but had he sufficient evidence to preclude a different point of view? Stratifications are never so regular as they appear in diagrams. Such a procedure would account for the apparent mixture of Monteverde and Anio tufa in the same wall when there is no evidence of a reuse of old material. Actually, it is often difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish the two. In that same mid-century post-war period, we can also turn to the judgment of the greatest studioso of the Roman tuffs, Gioacchino de Angelis Dosat. As a rule in his scholarship, de Angelis Dosat uses the term tuffo lithoide, lithoid tuff, with which we should now be familiar, sometimes distinguishing it further as tuffo lithoide da costruzione, construction-grade lithoid tuff, if you like. And within this deposit or eruptive unit, he does not distinguish different facies. He basically never talks about a Monteverde variety. In fact, he goes on to say, all the variations in the same deposit can be surprising. It is wrongly called Anio tuff, since important deposits are also found beyond that valley. These dissenting voices notwithstanding, Anio and Monteverde have continued to slouch on as distinct types. And this is understandable. There's a tendency among archaeologists to want to be as precise as possible. And we can see it in chronologies that offer a specious precision down to the decade, which often cannot be supported by the available evidence. In other ways, the studies of Marion Blake have been unfairly overlooked in favor of recourse to the books by Frank and Mooley, the latter of whom perpetuates the Anio Monteverde distinction despite having been advised by De Angelis Dosat. Further challenges to the posited distinction between Anio and Monteverde tuffs have arisen from the application of new methods of scientific analysis to the problems of the Roman tuffs, to which I turn now. Already in 1924, Frank had correctly noted the difficulty in applying chemical analysis to tuff because of the transformational effects of atmospheric exposure on the major elements that compose the majority of tuffs, such as silicon dioxide, aluminum oxide, ferric oxide, and calcium oxide. Geological research in the 2000s, however, demonstrated the possibility of using not major elements, but trace elements to discriminate between various eruptive units. Certain trace elements and compounds with low mobility, which means they remain relatively stable, such as zirconium, niobium, yttrium, thorium, tantalum, and titanium dioxide, are particularly useful in recognizing distinct eruptive products. And don't worry about the specifics right now. The relative concentration of these trace elements in the rock reflects their concentration in the source magma. Because the source magma is never the same from one eruption to the next, the trace elements can be read as a signature of each eruptive unit. And this is useful when the macroscopic appearance of one tuff does not clearly distinguish it from another. We can go further, however. Although the source magma is characterized by concentrations of trace elements within a certain range, as this magma erupts, there's a certain amount of sorting that happens, such that the concentration of trace elements at various points within the eruptive unit or lithofacies is nowhere identical. To take a hypothetical, overly schematized example for the sake of demonstration, within a given deposit, the concentration of, say, zirconium could be greater, closer to the volcanic vent, and lesser the further one goes from that vent, while niobium would follow a different pattern. Different zones of the lithofacies then would show different concentrations, which, if similar concentrations are identified in analyses of samples coming from ancient monuments, a provenience from that zone can be proposed for the materials in the monument. How do we measure trace elements in tuff? First of all, we need to take samples to physically chip off or detach a small piece from whatever it is we want to analyze. Generally speaking, we need samples from both the monument or monuments in question, as well as from a range of possible quarry or extraction areas. The samples do not need to be very large, on the order of 10 cubic centimeters, but this is a destructive method of analysis. And the samples, after preparation, are analyzed in the laboratory using inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometry, or ICP-MS for short. And again, if you have questions about the details of this, we can come back, but I won't go in and get super detailed right now. So rather than get further into detail here, let's consider some examples from some research projects that I've been involved in over recent years in Rome, each at sites of public sacred architecture from the Archaic and Republican periods. And in particular, I want to focus on Santo Mombono, probably one of the best known but least well understood sites in the city. What you see on the surface today are the remains of twin temples preserving traces of various building phases dating between the early Republican and the late Imperial period. The temples are identified as those of the goddesses Fortuna and Mater Metuta, mentioned by Livy among other ancient authors. Prior to the construction of the large platform and twin temples in the early 5th century BCE, the site hosted a much smaller temple structure, which is not currently visible, as it underlies the later structures and moreover sits beneath the modern water table. The difficulties of investigating the structure meant that identification of the material used for this, the earliest known temple building in Rome, remained uncertain. Excavation in 2014 exposed a small portion of the podium of this temple, which confirmed a date in the first quarter of the 6th century BCE for its construction during the Roman Archaic or Regal period, in which excavation further made it possible to take samples for geochemical and petrographic analysis. And this and the following studies I worked on in collaboration with my colleagues, the volcanologist Fabrizio Mara, the National Institute for Geophysics and Volcanology, and Professor Mario Gaeta in the Department of Geology at Sapienza. And our thanks go to the authorization of the Sovrintendenza Capitolina, and in particular Monica Cecchi for making it possible to undertake these analyses. Here, the geochemical results. So we have different fields that the trace element analyses that we can calculate from the results of the trace element analyses. And we can observe that the fields of the area along the Anio and of the stone extracted in the area of Monteverde are different. And so here the geochemical results suggest that the stone used for this first phase temple at Santo Mobono was extracted from the deposit of tuffo leonato exposed along the Anio River, an unexpected result. This is the earliest evidence for Roman builders sourcing building stone relatively distant, 5 kilometers as the eagle flies, 15 kilometers or more by river from the building site, and this at the beginning of the 6th century BCE. Further, thin section analysis indicates that the stone was quarried from near the base of the tuffo leonato deposit, a better consolidated lithofacies that is more resistant to weathering than the upper levels of the deposit, more usually exploited in later centuries. One possible explanation, though it can only remain a hypothesis given the nature of the evidence, is that because one of the functions of the podium was to raise the temple's perishable mud brick superstructure out of the range of the Tiber's annual floodwaters, the builders sought out a material that could adequately resist the river's ravages. In that case, they might have selected a rock outcrop that they saw successfully withstanding the currents of the Anio River. The results here further point to the need to challenge the dominant Frankian paradigm. One is that the date of the introduction of tuffo leonato needs to be pushed back by several centuries. In fact, the beginnings of the use of ashlar masonry at Rome in the early 6th century BCE. And Blake in 1947 had already expressed doubts along this line, but as so often, she was little heeded. The second point is that due to both the challenging observational conditions and the particular facies employed, mere visual observation of the stone was insufficient to identify its source. Finally, there's no ancient quarry observable today that precisely matches the characteristics of the stone in the podium, and yet one must once have existed. The existence of the podium proves it. While we are fortunate in having so many ancient quarries preserved around Rome, we have no way of knowing just how many others have been lost, making it misleading to base a typology purely on known quarries. A second study, also conducted in collaboration with Fabrizio and Mario, focused on elements of the Santo Mobono temples dated to the mid-Republican period. And in summarizing very rapidly, these analyses also confirmed that all of the tuffo leonato employed in the mid-Republican phases can be attributed to the extraction zone along the Anio River, contrary to previous mixed attribution of Anio and Monteverde. So our findings again counter the old orthodoxy that saw these used widely together and only from a fairly late date, the end of the mid-Republican or even into the late Republican periods. Now, both of these studies were carried out 6 or more years ago, an eternity in archaeological science years. And were I to design them today, I would do things somewhat differently. Nevertheless, I think the results point to the need for new ways of thinking about tuff and its areas of extraction, which could lead to differently theorized typologies. We have seen how quarry names have been applied as tuff terminology in the past. Vitruvius, you will recall, refers to the lapida quinae, the quarries that were most convenient for supplying the city with building stone, such that his stone names are also quarry names. Some of the names created or resuscitated by Frank take their names from quarry localities, such as Grotta Scura, and these are all localities that have been used as quarry names in the surroundings of Rome. Take their names from quarry localities and have led to confusion in successive literature because they have sometimes been used to have led to confusion in successive literature because they have sometimes been understood to mean stone of the type found in a particular quarry. So you observe a particular kind of stone at Grotta Scura, but that could be quarried elsewhere, but it takes its name from Grotta Scura, and at other times to mean stone extracted just from the Grotta Scura quarry. And a particular point about this is that the recent work, maybe less recent now, work by Seth Bernard on the so-called serving walls, calculating the amount of stone that would have been required for the original structure, The quarries that we can see today, or that were observed by Ashby in the early 20th century at Grotto Scora, could have supplied at most a tenth of the entire circuit wall. So even though it's a massive quarry, it's really only a fragment of what was needed to supply the walls. Vice versa, geological names given to eruptive units or facies that refer to type localities and not quarry locations, such as Tuffo del Palatino, have been misunderstood by archaeologists to refer to the particular quarries of extraction. And in all of this, moreover, no one has really defined what they have meant by the word quarry. How are its bounds established? We may innocently take the idea of a marble quarry relatively well bounded in space, whose limits require no special investigation. The Roman landscape, by contrast, is characterized by zones where ancient quarry faces run on for hundreds of meters, and accepting small gaps even for kilometers, and have thus sometimes used the term extraction zones in preference to quarry. The use of our geoarchaeological approaches offers a different possible percorso for arriving at quarry provenience. The distinctive signatures of different pyroclastic flows, within which there are further differentiated areas of concentrations of trace elements, can help us attribute particular structures to specific extraction areas of the Tuffo Leonato facies, for example. And we've recently undertaken studies to do the same with the so-called Capellaccio or Tuffo del Palatino, and with Lapis albanus, one study published just yesterday, which you can ask me about if you like. The geochemical provenience in studies carried out on the Roman tuffs thus far are only a beginning, only a proof of concept for the method. And moving forward, we really need larger sample sizes, and we need campaigns that are targeting the ancient landscape, both built and the extractive landscape, much more broadly. Of course, this requires time and especially money. I need to get better at asking for money from people who have it. Don't we all? But beyond and parallel to a broader campaign of geochemical and petrographic studies, I believe we also need to place a greater emphasis on careful documentation and broad level identification of stone building materials using macroscopic methods. Ideally, rather than simply publishing a structure, a wall, a foundation, or what have you, with a bare and unsupported identification as tuff or as Tuffo Leonato, Peperino, and so on, we should expect a level of documentary support similar to what we expect of other classes of material evidence. Magari, a detailed description noting textural characteristics, inclusions, and color, ideally on a fresh break, color photograph, scale, and color sheet. Just a suggestion. Because one of the persistent problems in scholarship on the architecture of the city of Rome is a lack of precise attention to building materials. And I don't mean simply that the materials themselves are not identified. Frequently in the literature, a name is assigned, Anio tuff, Tuffo di Monteverde, Grotto Scora tuff, Peperino, Capellaccio, but the identification is not supported by any evidence, such as a description of the textural characteristics of the stone or a detailed photograph. And we could see this as being akin for, say, publishing pottery, merely asserting the presence of certain shapes without publishing profile drawings or photographs. With the difference that ceramic analysis is an extremely well-developed and specialized subdiscipline within archaeology, and we might have more faith in those identifications made by ceramic specialists. And as I hope have demonstrated, we cannot rely solely on existing identifications in the literature. Take just one example. This is an altar, well-known altar displayed in a well-known museum in what we might informally call its Peperino galleries. And the altar at first glance seems to have the gray coloration and peppercorn inclusions that we associate, strictly guidebook with Peperino albano or lapis albanus. And that is what the museum placard informs us. In his book, in fact, Frank cites this particular altar as lapis albanus. A closer look, however, and this depends a little bit on the projection as well, but if you can, I don't know if you can make it out here. Closer look, where the surface alteration of the stone has been abraded or cleaned, reveals a tawny brown matrix that instead allows us to hypothesize an attribution as Tuffo Leonato and suggests a more detailed investigation of this monument might be warranted. In these kinds of studies, a reference collection would be of great help. To his credit, Frank based his typology on a collection of 50 tuff samples that he had collected from quarry sites and with permission from ancient monuments. He deposited this collection in the American Academy across town from here, and in the following decade, several researchers used it as a reference. In the post-war period, this collection was rearranged by no less a scholar than De Angelis Dosat himself. Unfortunately, institutional priorities change. These samples are no longer to be found. A new reference collection would have to be created from scratch, ideally with more formalized long-term institutional support. Once we have built up a reliable stock of more secure identifications of materials from well-documented contexts, documented systematically and scientifically, based first on careful autopsy, supplemented by geochemical and petrographic analyses when judged appropriate, only then, once we have the more reliable corpus to work with, can we begin to ask and start to answer more complex questions about the economics of local stone at Rome. Moreover, I would argue that rather than seek to replace a totalizing typology that draws on multiple classes of evidence and attempts to force them all into the same boxes, we need to be conscious of the existence of different kinds of typology that respond to different kinds of demands and employ each where appropriate. This is not to say that we shouldn't try to put Vitruvius in conversation with extraction areas and volcanic lithofacies, simply that we are ill-served by imagining an all-purpose typology. To put this another way, a geochemical study can identify an eruptive unit and potentially a particular lithofacies within that eruptive unit, but geochemistry can never identify a particular wall as being built of Vitruvius's lapis rubere. We should also remember that many of the names and categories we are familiar with, such as Grotto Scura, Anio, and Monteverde, are inventions of the 20th century, which have not been demonstrated to correspond to ancient understandings of the material. While they may have been constructed in good faith as analytical categories a century ago, I suspect that they may have outlived their usefulness. Grotto Scura tuff is a case in point. We archaeologists have learned that to stay current, we should call this by the geological name of its eruptive unit, namely tuffo giallo della Via Tiberina, yellow tuff of Tiber Street, of the Via Tiberina. Effectively, however, nothing has changed but the name, which lends a specious veneer of scientific credibility. Yet, 70 years ago, De Angelis Dosat had identified 4 distinct types of yellow tuff employed in Roman monuments, even if the so-called Grotto Scura was probably the most common. No archaeological study since that I know of, at least for Rome itself, Ostia is a different matter, has really taken De Angelis Dosat's observations about tuffo giallo seriously. I want to leave you with one final set of images. Frank based his types on the quarries that he could identified largely by localities in the landscape. Some of them, we've seen many of them already. And those quarries remain important for our understanding, but we now know of a much greater number of ancient extraction areas. On the map, you see quarries that are present in the archaeological geodatabase made available by the CTAR project, many of which have been documented in the course of rescue or development-driven archaeology over the past several decades. If you're not familiar with CTAR, this is a wonderful resource that aims to is a geodatabase to collect all of this information from what would otherwise enter with a so-called gray literature from rescue excavations and make it available to the scientific community, but also to the public at large, and bring that together with existing known structures, that sort of thing. But you can see just how much the picture is different here. Now, many of these quarries documented in CTAR are of a smaller scale than those cited by Frank. And some of these on the map include pozzolana quarries, which you'll remember chemically is the same as lithoid tuff. It's just that it hasn't undergone that lithoid process. But even here, this is another aspect where we need to problematize our inherited categories. In recent decades, we've turned up quarries where what is geologically classified as pozzolana, it's in that upper deposit of pozzolana, but it's locally lithified, so it acts like a tuff. But what do we don't have a name for that in the sort of in this classic, these classic typologies. So many of these more recently discovered quarries are of a smaller scale than those cited by Frank, but they nonetheless represent an important part of the construction history and of the economy of Rome and its hinterland, which will have to be adequately integrated into any future comprehensive study of the role of the Roman tuffs in antiquity. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan, for that masterclass on Roman building material, both further the scientific analysis, but also the importance of historiography, and then also making the case for the need to really study building materials in order to understand buildings. I suppose you don't study classics and literature without knowing what letters mean, and it's something akin to that. So there will be a microphone coming around the room, and if those listening online have questions, they can type them in here while people gather their thoughts. I thought I might ask. So I'm not sure I should be thanking you for kind of complicating and exposing my incredibly simplistic, well, now it turns out incredibly simplistic understanding of tuff. In comparison, so you showed Filippo Corelli and Amanda Claridge's guide up there with their categories, and they're coming from Frank.
Yeah.
What would you do to that now in order to both, obviously not everyone can have your level of knowledge on this and go into it. So what would you do? Would you get rid of most of those names? How would you go about dealing with that?
No, it's a fair question. I mean, any attempt at deconstruction should ideally, propose something. I suppose, your particular research interests probably lead you to, what can I recycle from these existing lists, right? It's a fair question, and I think they're good enough at a basic level, right? But they can't be the end of the question, right? And and they certainly preserve a historic value, right? We've had a century of literature making use of these terms. We can't just throw them all out. But I think what I guess what I would ask, what I would propose is, just instead of having one list, that we have a just gently introduce a little bit of the geological terminology, right? Just to say, okay, that we have different eruptive units, or we can go by eruptive unit, or we can call them lithofacies, as you like, and say, okay, tuffo leonato. I think this is a useful category because, I mean, given the current state of knowledge, unless a particular analysis has been done, we can't say where it comes from. But that's sort of, so I think for lapis albanus, that's pretty clear, right? So some of these names are we can keep. Whether so lapis albanus is a relatively restricted eruptive unit. We're pretty certain that what Vitruvius calls lapis albanus is what we can see in the landscape today. Same thing with lapis gabinus, right? So that basically outcrops only around the ancient city of Gabi, and it's pretty visually distinctive. For the tuffo leonato, I think by continuing to distinguish between Anio and Monteverde, we're claiming a level of knowledge that's actually not supported, right? And then just, even if they do correspond to different facies, we can't say that, that facies actually exists both along the Anio and at Monteverde. It's just that Frank saw some of those and called them Monteverde, and saw different ones and called those Anio, and said they didn't quarry them in the different places, but actually they did. All right, so I think some names can stay, but we also, I think, I would like to see a greater caution in applying the names of Vitruvius to to the modern materials, because we really don't know what Vitruvius meant by, so an example I didn't have time to go into, but so for us, lapis rubere, right? Red stone. You might think, okay, well, of all of these, the only red stone is tuffolianato, right? So case closed. Well, Giuseppe Lulli, in the middle of the 20th century, for those who don't know, one of the most important scholars of Roman architecture and construction, said, actually, no, lapis rubere is the yellow tuff, and lapis polens is what we call tuffolianato. And you say, well, this Lulli guy, is he crazy? Well, if you look at Vitruvius talking about the Campanian materials, he says there are two kinds of tuff in Campania, the black kind and the red kind, right? And so we've seen, so the two tuffs that are quarried today are called tuffo grigio, gray tuff, and tuffo giallo, yellow tuff, which we saw the fine-grained description of in Dell'Erba, right? So, I mean, these ancient color terms are ambiguous. So we can't, what's, especially this yellow and red. So, so this is sort of, so when Seth Bernard says, okay, we see these, the fact that Vitruvius is talking about the quarries at Fidenae and the lapis polens, which most people today associate with the tuffo giallo, means that he's probably dealing with a mid-Republican typology when these types of stone were still in use. It's weird that he's talking about them because they're not really quarried in his day. Well, we don't know that. We don't know that Fidenae tuff is what modern archaeologists call Fidenae tuff. This is an assumption that was made 100 years ago and has never really been re-examined. So I think there are a lot of, in short answer, I think, the basic list can stay with maybe some asterisks, and then just getting rid of Anio and Monteverde.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. I'd like to open it up. Are there any questions in the room?
Can you tell us about the tuffo debate?
I can, yes. This comes up all the time, right? So is eventually. Yeah, it's all right for now. Right, so is one correct? Is tuff correct, or is tuffa correct? So they, okay. Yes, the answer is yes. So they both terms ultimately come from Latin tophus, which itself is actually not Latin in origin. The form of it, that intervocalic F, means that it's probably a borrowing from an Italic language like Oscan or Umbrian. And we actually have probably the word attested in Oscan, right? So this is a nice building inscription from Campania, from Atella and Abella rather, which is specifying the material of the base, the batrum talfud. Which is, so we have here an Oscan talfus, where we actually don't know whether it's neuter or masculine, but let's say it's only in the ablative here, talfud. But so we actually have the attested term in Oscan, from which Latin tophus is probably borrowed. But when it comes into Latin, it's only attested twice in Oscan. In fact, it's attested at all as a miracle. But so we don't know exactly what it's referring to here. Although given the volcanic nature of Campania, it could well be volcanic tuff. It comes into Latin, and you have Vitruvius using it for clearly volcanic stone in Campania, but you have Virgil using it in poetic fashion, but in probably a calcareous, limestone sort of territory landscape. And that continues through Latin antiquity. So really this tophus, it just seems to be referring to a kind of soft, crumbly stone that's sort of porous and can be jagged. And then, so that, is what gives us Italian tuffo. But dialect variation in Italian is massive. And so you actually get tufa and tufo in various regional dialects of Italian. So, and then tuff in English comes from French, which of course got it from, well, it actually got from Italian. Tuff is the earlier form to come into English in the 17th century, but it's used to describe limestone materials. Sir William Hamilton, talking about the volcanic geology of Campania, introduces tufa into English to refer to the volcanic stone. So both have their precedent. And then it's only in the last 100 years that geologists have said, we really need to get our terminology straight. We want to try to have, one word that refers to the stuff that's formed by volcanoes, and one that's formed for the type of stone that's formed out of that's a sort of limestone. And they decided that tuff would be volcanic and tufa would be limestone. And I used to think that this was a relatively recent innovation, but literally 100 years ago, there's a geologist begging to archaeologists to stop using these terms willy-nilly, but of course we persist. So both are correct. If you want to make the geologists happy, use tuff for volcanic stone and tufa for the limestone. And you might think, well, it's all context dependent anyway. I know of one city, it's a relatively minor town called Pompeii, where you find both volcanic tuff and calcareous tufa used sometimes even in the same structures. But thank you for the question.
Thank you. You mentioned on the different physical characteristics and how to kind of start dictating the different ones. I was wondering what affects the different qualities of the different types of tuff from different quarries, and if it's just based on zone or, yeah.
Sure, so within the different, so between the different types or within a particular deposit or both? Right. Yeah, right. Sure. Let's, oh, 1, 2. Let's see. Yeah, so it's a great question. Now, and I'll take sort of both aspects of. Sorry. All right, one more. Okay, let's stay here. So I'll take one. So if we look at the between sort of what have been identified as different, the different types, right? We can see already from that first temple at Santo Mombono, this one here, that probably they're searching out a particular kind of stone that's more resistant to act as the podium. Now, the stone that's used, for instance, for the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline, so-called Capolaccio or Tufo del Palatino, I mean, it's very easy to cut, but it doesn't weather very well at all. Like if you've seen where it's exposed around the city, in some cases it's just kind of eroding away. And these are the sorts of effects that Vitruvius comments on sort of among the soft stones, even if we don't know exactly which stone type he's talking about. So it's easy to cut, but it doesn't weather very well. But if you have to build massive foundations that are mostly going to be underground, you want to minimize labor time, you want to minimize effort, and if it's underground, it's not going to be exposed to weathering anyhow. So, and in this case, a year or two ago, we actually analyzed the stone used for the Temple of Jupiter, and it was probably quarried from the base of the Capitoline Hill itself, so shortest possible transit from the quarries. But as these other kinds of stone are introduced, there's clearly a working out sort of a cost-benefit analysis. And we see this really nicely in the temples at Santo Mobono. So for instance, in this phase that we can date to 212 BCE, thanks to a fire destruction and a couple of passages in Livy. So when they rebuild the temple, these two temples, they use different kinds of material for particular parts of the structure, right? So they're no longer using, at least in this work site, the Tuffo del Palatino or Capolaccio, although it's still present, from earlier phases. But when they need to build foundations that are not going to be exposed, so that are relatively easy to cut, light to transport. It doesn't matter if they're not very weather resistant because they're not exposed. So they use the tuffo giallo, probably, maybe from Rota Square, we don't know. And then for the sort of workaday stone, that's a good mix, of being resistant, not too hard to work, but not too hard to work. Also relatively easy to transport because it's probably coming down the river. Tuffo leonato. So basically for all of the pavement, all of the edges of the podium, the stairs, probably some of the column drums, they're using tuffo leonato. It's a sort of a good mix. For special purposes, they're using lapis albanus. So if they need to do a molding on the podium, so probably for column capitals and bases, for the altars, again, which need to take a molding. So this is the finest grain of the tuffs, this lapis albanus. So it allows you to carve these delicate moldings, but it's also the densest, along with lapis gabienus, but and it's not near one of the major rivers, so it's probably certainly more expensive to cut. It's probably more expensive to transport, so they use it only where it's really necessary. So, this is a nice sort of example. Now, if we're talking about variation within deposits, this is a part where, it really, geological maps are great. They make our lives, easier up to a point, but they don't, the amount of local variation within a big blob of purple on the map can be extreme, right? And so if you think that you have an area of ancient quarry, you need to go and look, because there are parts where it may be well lithified, and you see ancient quarry faces that are 15 meters high, right? They clearly saw that it was good building material, and they extracted it. But that stone could change. You can actually see in their ancient quarries where the extraction stops, and if you look at the quarry face, you can actually see where there are cracks in the deposit, right, that make it such that you can't extract the blocks of the same dimension that you're trying to extract. So you can get quite a variation. If we think, and the different types that we see in Dell'Erba, sort of in the Neapolitan tuff, so these have to do a lot with sort of these micro characteristics, like are there fractures, and how is it fracturing? How big is the grain size? Sort of different ways of thinking about hardness. So, you can maybe scratch it with your fingernail, but you can't break it with your hammer. So right. So it's soft, but hard at once. They have different terms for these different kinds of micro zones within the tuff deposit.
Okay, so there was an online question, but it's disappeared. For those of you who've got questions still in the audience, save them for afterwards, but let's just take the online question as our final one. Yeah. Okay, so from Timothy Teeter, who asks, are you in fact questioning the dating of the Servian walls to the early 4th century?
That at least I can answer fairly simply. No, I'm not questioning that dating. I think that, so I can see where the question would arise. So I said, well, we have thought about just sort of one type of yellow tuff coming from the territory of A. And if there are actually 4 different types, or who knows, maybe more, is it possible that hypothesis no longer holds? Well, as it turns out, basically all of the 4 yellow tuffs that De Angelis Dosset identified are all from the territory of A. So even if it turned out that parts of the walls were built, in one of these other types of tuffo giallo, it wouldn't materially change that conclusion that the stone was coming from the territory of A. So either they had to be really good, on really good terms, or which I think no one would hypothesize today, or that it must post-date the siege and taking of Veii.
Okay, I'm very happy to hear that, because it's the one thing tonight, I think, that kind of can just keep stable. So on that note of relief, that there is one part of Roman architecture that we can kind of hang on to following Dan's analysis and his research into all of this. I'd like to invite everyone here upstairs for a drink, but not before we thank Dan again for a wonderful talk.